On July 18, 1936, Spain would be thrown into a tragic and devastating civil war that would lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, ravage the country politically, socially, and economically, and plunge Spain into a dark era of fascist dictatorial repression under General Francisco Franco. On that day, Franco attempted a coup to overthrow the democratically elected Second Spanish Republic, urging members of the military to rise up and overthrow the rightful government. Although the left-wing Popular Front won 285 seats versus the right and centre's 131 and 57 respectively, the popular vote was much closer, with the left gaining a 1.5% lead over the right. The uprising was to be swift, but Franco misjudged his support, and the Republic maintained control of most of the country. Franco's coup d'etat failed, but the deep divisions in the nation along political, religious, economic, and social lines plunged the nation into a civil war lasting until April 1939. This video will examine the background leading up to the coup, the events of the rebellion itself, and its aftermath. The origins of the Spanish Civil War go back to 1931, when the Republic was proclaimed and the monarchy abolished. Miguel Primo de Rivera, the military dictator of Spain for 7 years, was overthrown in January 1930, and municipal elections in April 1931 led to a landslide victory for the Republicans led by Niceto Alcalá Zamora. Although popular, this new government inherited many of Primo de Rivera's mistakes, including massive debts and the collapsing peseta currency. Foreign investors, such as Morgan's Bank, cancelled their loans due to the left-wing nature of the new government. Although things weren't going well for the fledgling republic, their efforts to tackle the power of an inflated military establishment only made things worse. The military occupied a very powerful role in Spain. In 1820, they overthrew the absolute monarchy in favour of a constitutional one, and when the First Republic was established in 1870, would overthrow it in 1871 to re-establish the constitutional monarchy. Although occupying a prestigious position as defenders of the nation and Spanish Empire, their failure to defeat the United States in the Spanish-American War of 1898, which saw the Spanish Empire dealt its final blow, greatly diminished their standing in Spanish society. They became increasingly unpopular due to their horrific repressions in the wakes of strikes and protests by workers and peasants against the state. Although the left-wing republic was in power, strikes and revolts by trade unions and anarchists, particularly in the region of Andalusia, were met with horrific reprisals by the Guardia Civil, who regularly opened fire on protesters and strikers, and once, in retaliation for an attack on a civil guard outpost by anarchists, executed 12 of them in cold blood. In 1933, the left-wing government of the Republic lost to the right-wing Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas, or CEDA, and the PRR, Radical Republicans, in elections held in November that year. Although winning the popular vote, President Alcalá Zamora denied CEDA representatives cabinet positions for almost a year. The reactionary policies of the new establishment revived the military and church, which had been strongly impacted by the progressive and anti-clerical reforms of the previous government. Anti-church policies included implementing an official separation of church and state, expropriating church property, ending church subsidies, and exiling prominent cardinals and bishops. Cardinal Segura, ironically enough, proclaimed that everyone in Spain was, quote, either a Catholic or nothing at all, in spite of the fact that only 20% of Spain's population attended Mass, the lowest of any Christian country in Europe. The church was also unpopular due to its hypocrisy and support for the traditional powers and aristocrats, defending the class interests of the wealthy against the forces of progress and socialism. Upon taking power, the right Republican government re-established church control over education, subsidies and wages for clergy, and halted Azaña's land reforms. In October 1934, miners in Asturias revolted against the possibility of a right-wing government. In spite of their democratic legitimacy in the 1933 elections, President Alcalá Zamora appointed 3 CEDA members to join the cabinet in 1934. The PRR were more moderate conservatives, but the CEDA, led by José María Gil Robles, were far-right Catholic authoritarians. Their revolt was backed by the PSOE, the Socialist Workers' Party, and its union, the UGT, along with the anarcho-syndicalists of the CNT and anarchists of the FAI. More violence broke out between the workers and the military, with the military forces, led by Manuel Godet and Francisco Franco, engaging in brutal repression against the revolt. This repression was sanctioned by Manuel Azaña, the Republican Minister of War, to prevent a revolution. In a period of 15 days, 1,700 revolters were killed and 260 Spanish troops died. These repressions, far from diminishing the resolve of the anarchists and peasants in Asturias and Catalonia, only strengthened their desire for stateless independence. Although both left-wing, the anarchists saw the UGT as moderates, and even by some as enemies of the working class. These tensions would come to pass later when the Civil War began. At the end of 1935, political scandals forced the CEDA-PRR coalition to collapse. President Alcalá Zamora appointed former governor of Catalonia, Manuel Portella Valladares, as head of the new government. New elections were later announced for February 16th. On January 15th, the left and centre-left parties agreed to contest the February elections as part of a united popular front. The outcome of the election was described in fatalistic terms by both the right and the left. Francisco Lagro Caballero, the head of the Socialist Workers' Party, proclaimed that, quote, "If the right win the elections, we will have to go straight to open civil war." Similar sentiments were echoed by the right. The Popular Front won the elections in February, seizing 285 seats in Parliament, while the centre gained 57 and the right won 31. However, the popular vote was much closer, with the Popular Front gaining a lead of 1.5% over its rivals. The far-left grew more revolutionary in the wake of their successes, believing it to be the prelude to a socialist revolution, and the right was convinced that they would have to go to war to prevent such a thing from happening. Manuel Azaña, now Prime Minister, knew that measures needed to be taken to prevent a potential military uprising by discontented officers. Between February 22nd and 28th, the top positions in the Spanish military were purged of conservative elements in favor of generals sympathetic, or at the very least tolerant of the Republic. The 3 Army Inspector Generals were replaced with politically loyal officers. Francisco Franco and Manuel Godet, who were key in the suppression of the 1934 revolt, were confined to isolated posts, with Franco being exiled to the Canary Islands and Godet to the Balearics. Generals Joaquin Fanjul, José Enrique Varela, and Luis Orgaz were deprived of their commands, and the latter 2 were imprisoned. Although winning a marginal victory, an emboldened left set forth to implement its revolutionary agenda, including freeing prisoners arrested during the Asturian Revolution, which horrified the right. Left-wing groups like the anarchists encouraged peasants to seize land and estates in anticipation of a social revolution. The peasants had grown impatient of the reformist approach to land redistribution by the Republican government, with one peasant leader writing, quote, "Disappointment is once again setting in, and we are on the same road as that of 1931. Is the Popular Front government going to destroy the illusions of the peasants? Are the peasants ready to see their hopes evaporate yet again? No. They want land, and those whose job it is to let them have it must not be surprised should they fail to quicken their pace if the peasants seize what the government does not and give them what they need so badly." Farm workers in 90 villages in Salamanca seized the land they worked on in March, and more followed suit in Toledo province. As Edward E. Malefacus, an American historian, writes of the situation, quote, "Just as the electoral victory of the centre-right in 1933 had permitted the established classes to revenge themselves upon the workers in hundreds of small ways, most of them in defiance of the law, so too the victory of the Popular Front gave the workers license to impose their will with impunity. Intimidation of all those who did not belong to the labour unions seemed to have become the order of the day. Perhaps the most constant source of trouble was the gangs of workers who entered farms to force their managers to grant work. The stealing of animals and crops and the cutting of trees for firewood or for lumber also became common. Although Azaña, much more moderate than these far-left groups, disliked these revolutionary measures, instead opting to act within the democratic and constitutional framework of the Republic, his inaction during this time made many on the right believe that such acts were being condoned by him. Behind the scenes, key right-wing figures plotted for an eventual coup d'etat. Franco, although isolated and deprived of any serious military post, now had 5 months to plot and plan. He sent an emissary to the Director General of the Civil Guard, General Pozas, asking him to make the decisions which needed to be taken in the defense of order and the well-being of Spain. The various groups that formed the 2 factions that would be pitted against one another during the Civil War would begin to forge closer bonds. Right-wing leaders such as Antonio Goycochea, head of the Alfonsine monarchist party Renovación Española, was planning for an insurrection as early as 1934. José Calvo Sotelo, the parliamentary head of Alfonsine and Carlist monarchists, proclaimed in April 1936 that if the government shows weakness, if it vacillates, we must stand up here and shout that we are ready to resist with every means, saying that the precedent of extermination, of tragic destruction that the bourgeois and conservative classes experienced in Russia will not be repeated in Spain. Military officers and leaders see that the reforms that sought to divert funds from the army to welfare programs and other programs designed to help the poor. Many right-wing officers and soldiers saw the revolutionary fervor of some of the peasantry and industrial workers of Catalonia as a Jewish communist plot to overthrow the church and create a state of disorder and anarchy in Spain. The church declared that, quote, under the influence and direction of the Judeo-Masonic world conspiracy, are declaring a war to the finish against us. Similar sentiments were echoed by the deeply religious Carlists. The landowners and employers of Spain, seeing the revolutionary attitude of workers and peasants in certain regions, along with their almost impossible to satisfy wage demands, meant they looked for a solution to a rapidly radicalizing left. The Falange Española, the most ostensibly fascist group on the right, formed in October 1933 and led by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, were most responsible out of the right-wing groups for causing disorder. Unlike the fascism of Italy or Germany, however, Falangism was very conservative, traditionalist, and highly religious. There was discord amongst the right-wing forces as well. Gil Robles, head of the CEDA, proclaimed that the party had no affinity for fascist ideology, seeing themselves as nationalists and seeing fascism as a foreign ideology. Robles was also committed, at least verbally, to a policy of non-violence and remaining within the democratic framework of the Republic, a stance that brought derision from the Falange. That being said, there is ample evidence showing that, although Robles was kept in the dark about the military conspiracy, he did more than simply sit on the fence, in fact encouraging party members to, quote, act according to their consciences without implicating the party. Although the Falange requested financial assistance from the Italians and Germans, both Hitler and Mussolini found them too politically unreliable, choosing to bank Franco instead. Franco's sympathizers in London hired a plane to fly him to Spanish Morocco to lead the Army of Africa, and Franco sent 2 envoys to Mussolini and Hitler, who promised to give Franco whatever he needed to win the war. Franco plotted domestically with the Falange and monarchist groups, sympathetic officers, and was now in command of the 40,000 elite soldiers of the Army of Africa. With the stark divisions and tensions in Spanish society leading up to July 1936, a civil war was inevitable, whether or not Franco's planned uprising was successful. Lines have been drawn between the forces of the left, ranging from liberals to anarchists, and the forces of the right, including fascists, Catholics, monarchists, landowners, and employers. The CEDA, once a significant force in Spanish Parliament, saw its ranks decimated by defections to more radical right-wing parties like the Falange. The events of the past 5 years would finally bubble over when the coup began, and ensure that it would not remain as such for long. Azanio's so-called exile of key Spanish officers was a double-edged sword for the Republicans. On the one hand, it kept key figures away from mainland Spain, which would assist in the immediate coup, but in an age of aviation was hardly a true exile. Although Godet and Franco were isolated to overseas posts, General Emilio Mola, the main organizer of the conspiracy, was posted to Pamplona, the heartland of the Carlists. Mola met with various groups in the first half of 1936 and stressed the importance of military unity with the various right-wing anti-republican factions for the success of the coup. The Union Militar Repubblica Antifascista, or UMRA, a faction of leftist officers in the military concentrated largely in the assault guard, warned of a planned coup on 16 July, giving the government a list of key figures that would be involved in the coup, including Mola, Franco, and Godet. Azania and Casares Quiroga, the Spanish PM, ignored or downplayed the immediate threat of a rightist coup, believing that it would amount to nothing and being more concerned with the revolutionary activities of the left. The communists understandably demanded that reactionary officers of the army and state apparatus be purged to prevent an overthrow of the Republic, but nothing came of this. On the 13th of July, just a few days before the coup, rogue assault guards and civil guards part of the UMRA executed José Calvo Sotelo, the head of the monarchist parties in Parliament, in retaliation for the assassination of Lieutenant José Castillo Cerilla on the 12th by Phalangists. The right was outraged, and despite warnings from generals loyal to the Republic, communists and social deputies, the moderates still ignored them, with the head of government insisting that Mola is loyal to the Republic. Mola, in coded telegrams, gave the order for the Army of Africa led by Franco to revolt at 5 a.m. on July 18th, and the rest of the army to follow suit 24 hours later. The 24-hour delay was to allow Franco to secure Spanish Morocco before transporting the army by ship to the Andalusian coast. The Army of Africa was comprised of mercenary natives and the Foreign Legion, comprising of criminals and fugitives, and was ruthlessly efficient in suppressing the Asturian revolt of 1934. Spanish Morocco fell quickly, as there were few officers loyal to the Republic, Moroccan soldiers being told that the Republic wanted to abolish Allah, and Spanish workers in the region lacking the support or arms to effectively fight back. The regulares of the Army of Africa were let loose in Morocco to terrorize and murder leftists and trade unionists. As the rebellion continued to unravel, the Republican government still refused to acknowledge the increasingly more dangerous threat posed by the right. Workers of the CNT and UGT crowded around government buildings demanding arms to defend against the reactionary uprising, but were refused. Many had hidden weapons after the failed Asturian revolts and began to dig them up. The CNT and UGT in areas would then declare a general strike and fight with whatever weapons they had, constructing the iconic barricades to defend against the rebels. In other instances, if troops in their barracks wavered, giving enough time for workers to surround them, they often surrendered. On the 18th at 2 p.m., the Seville military garrison was captured by the rebels, and other provincial capitals saw similar uprising. In Cadiz at 4 p.m., Malaga at 5, Cordova at 6, Valladolid at 12:30 a.m. the following day, and Burgos at 2 a.m. Seville was strategically important for the rebels in their march on Madrid, and General Queipo de Llano with 4,000 men seized the city. It was only after the defection of the civil and assault guards that workers in Seville reacted. Broadcasts over Radio Seville encouraged peasants from the countryside to help counter the rebellion, but feuding between communists and anarchists prevented any effective resistance. Malaga, on the other hand, had a much different fate. In that town, the workers trusted the assault guards, and when news of the rising reached the garrison there and soldiers marched on the streets, the assault guards opened fire. The civil guard colonel, very unusually, was arrested by his own men, and the combined force of civil and assault guards and Malagan workers surrounded the military barracks, forcing their surrender. In Almeria, the civil governor refused to arm the workers to avoid provoking the military. On the 21st, the destroyer La Panta arrived at its port, securing it for the Republic. Threatening to shell the civil guard headquarters in the town, the garrison surrendered. In Jaén, the civil governor adopted a proactive approach, summoning the civil guard and ordering them to surrender their weapons. Although the civil guard protested this, insisting they were loyal to the Republic, the governor handed their arms to CNT and UGT workers. Had other towns taken such a proactive approach, even less territory would have fallen into rebel hands in the early stages of the coup. Santander was secured on the morning of the 19th when the 23rd Infantry Regiment refused to rebel. In Oviedo, the left were too confident in the loyalty of Colonel Aranda, the military commander, who stabbed the workers in the back. The workers quickly reacted to his betrayal, besieging the town. In Gijón, dock workers confronted troops commanded by Colonel Pinilla, besieging their barracks for over a month before eventually blowing it up. In Barcelona, rebel troops marched on the city to crush an anarchist uprising on the 19th. Infantry, cavalry, and dragoons were met with sniper fire, homemade bombs, and barricaded streets. Workers' militias were famously successful in crushing a poorly organized military uprising, and were supported by the civil guards and assault guards. During the fighting in Avenida Icaria, a group of workers and assault guards approached a rebel artillery detachment, pleading with them to join their brothers and turn their guns on the rebels. The guns were turned around, and more rebel soldiers defected to the side of the workers. General Guedet arrived at 11 a.m. from Mallorca, but it was to no avail. By the morning of the 20th, all rebel troops were surrounded at the Drossanes barracks and forced to surrender. Guedet and other nationalist officers were imprisoned, tried, and executed in August. The case of the Navy is also very interesting. Due to the nationalists planning for the Army of Africa to make its way to the mainland, the Navy played a key role in their plans. Although naval officers were strongly reactionary and overwhelmingly supportive of the rebellion, the lower ranks were almost completely the opposite. In preparation for the rising, junior ranks in the Navy held a secret conference on July 13th to discuss what they should do if their officers rebelled. In most cases, once the uprising began, junior sailors overwhelmed their officers, seizing control of their vessels. Commissar General of the Navy during the war, Bruno Alonso, reported that 70% of officers were killed by their men, and sailor committees exercised authority due to the traditional injustices and humiliations they suffered at the hands of their officers. The government also ordered the Navy send all its warships to the Gibraltar Strait to prevent the Army of Africa from reaching the mainland. In nationalist-controlled territory, a series of killings took place as part of their White Terror campaign. Nationalist commanders spoke of limpieza, or cleansing, and bands of reactionary soldiers and militias captured workers and unionists, marching them to fields and courtyards and executing them. In the Carlist stronghold of Pamplona, the uprising was welcomed almost as if it were a festival, with red berets flooding the streets in celebration. Any who attempted to resist the uprising were massacred. In the town of Huesca, the nationalists executed 100 supposed Freemasons who were targets due to their anti-clerical nature. Curiously, however, the Masonic order in the town boasted no more than a dozen members. Leftist figures and those sympathetic to the Popular Front that were known to the nationalists were executed. In Navarre, 10% of Popular Front voters were executed, including a priest who protested the killings. In Cordova, a diabetic socialist parliamentary deputy was imprisoned and force-fed sugar by his nationalist captors until he died. In spite of defections and successes in some areas, Franco's coup had ultimately failed to seize control of Spain. Although the nationalists had failed, this did not mean that the Republicans had succeeded, and their failure to crush the uprising in the first few days ensured that this failed coup would not remain as such and would escalate into a full-blown civil war. The Republic was divided by defections to the rebels, and the Republican government at that stage was a government without an army, police force, or administrative machinery. Of the 34,320 officers and men in the Civil Guard, roughly 20,120 remained loyal, although some historians estimate that the split was closer to 50-50. The Assault Guard, a militarized police force created by the Republic to police the urban areas, numbering 25,000 officers and men at the time of the coup, was also split with anywhere from 50 to 60% siding with the Republic. The Nationalists retained control of the Army of Africa, a force of 40,000 highly trained soldiers, two-thirds of the Carabineros, and 50,000 soldiers from the regular Spanish army. In all, this represented a combined force of approximately 130,000 soldiers, including 17 generals and 10,000 officers. The Republic had roughly 90,000 soldiers, including 50,000 from the regular army, 22 generals, and 7,000 officers, the remaining 33,000 coming from the various left-wing paramilitary groups. The Republican Navy, on the other hand, was firmly on the side of the Republic, and their loyalty ensured that the Army of Africa was unable to cross to the mainland in its entirety during the initial days of the coup, and were forced to be airlifted using Junker 852s supplied by Adolf Hitler. The Republican Air Force also remained largely loyal. At this stage, it appeared that the Republic was in a strong position to wage a protracted war and eventually win against the nationalist forces. They retained control of roughly two-thirds of the country's land area, including the large cities, mining areas, and industrial areas. The Republicans also controlled all of Spain's gold reserves and the citrus trade in Valencia, which was Spain's largest foreign currency earner at the time. Of the 8 military garrisons in the country, only the Seville garrison had fallen to the nationalists, with the remainder still in Republican hands. Furthermore, although very distasteful and distrustful of the Republican government, the anarchists in Catalonia and Basque nationalists had thrown themselves in with the Republicans, taking up arms against the nationalists who they saw as a greater threat to their ambitions for autonomous governance. Although the battle lines and zones of control were still fluid at this point, both sides began setting out to carry out their ideological goals and actions. In Republican territories, revolutionary tribunals were set up in towns and villages, supplanting the courts of law and dispensing justice as they saw fit. Local committees were set up in place of local governing bodies made up of the workers and peasants of that particular region. It was a true social revolution taking place, with unions and workers and peasant committees seizing control of their towns and workplaces. Although the Republican government still existed, it was in effect totally impotent in the wake of the bottom-up revolution that was taking place. As Andres Nin, a leader in the POUM, stated, quote, "The government does not exist. We collaborate with them, but they can do no more than sanction whatever is done by the masses. Workers control the factories, the banks, the land, and the arms in Catalonia and other regions of Spain as part of the wide-reaching socialist revolution that was taking place. Many anarchists began burning banknotes, which they saw as emblematic of greed and corruption of capitalist society, and emptied the prisons, which they saw as the epitome of statist repression. Hundreds of churches and convents were either burnt or put to secular uses in accordance with the left's, and particularly the anarchist virulent anti-clericism. An anarchist youth manifesto stated that, quote, "For the revolution to be a fact, we must demolish the 3 pillars of reaction: the church, the army, and capitalism." There were reports of priests being burnt alive in their churches, along with disembowelment and castrations. Executions were carried out by these aforementioned tribunals, leftist militias, and peasant groups against priests, landowners, and reactionaries. Even so, this did not mean blanket repression against all priests, landowners, factory owners, or the professional classes. For example, in the Basque region, which had sided with the Republic, the church was untouched, and many priests had openly supported and pledged allegiance to the Republican cause. Furthermore, any lawyer, shopkeeper, or factory owner who had not taken advantage of the workforce or the poor was left unmolested, and in some cases, factory owners were even welcomed into their new cooperative workplace. Known exploiters, on the other hand, were not shown any mercy. Although many of those sentenced to their death were guilty of their accusations, owing to the spontaneous nature of the justice carried out, many innocent people were unjustly killed. Some militiamen and other unsavory individuals took advantage of the chaos to enact revenge against their personal enemies for their own motives. In one instance, for example, an older inter-union dispute between the UGT and CNT led to the execution of Desiderio Trias, head of the UGT dockers, by CNT members for denying them work earlier. This execution was immediately condemned by the CNT-FAI leadership, who promised to arrest and execute the members who had taken advantage of the revolution for their own personal motives, and did just that. A lot of the excesses carried out by the left can also be blamed on newly released prisoners by the anarchists, who had joined their ranks with little scrutiny and continued to carry out criminal activities under the red and black banner. So lax were the CNT's recruitment standards that many phalangists also joined their ranks to escape persecution. Many of the most violent acts were perpetuated by civil and assault guards, who, although were loyal to the Republic, were eager to prove that loyalty by ruthlessly eliminating its perceived enemies. Prominent Catalan anarchist Diego Abad de Santillan avowed that, quote, "We do not wish to deny that the 19th of July brought with it an overflowing of passions and abuses, a natural phenomenon of the transfer of power from the hands of the privileged to the hands of the people. It is possible that our victory resulted in the death by violence of 4,000 or 5,000 inhabitants of Catalonia who were listed as rioters and were linked to political or ecclesiastical reaction. But this shedding of blood is the inevitable consequence of a revolution, which, in spite of all barriers, sweeps on like a flood and devastates everything in its path until it gradually loses its momentum. The initial days of the coup and following it saw the most violence take place, but even then, many Republicans attempted to save people from death. President Azania rescued the monks from his college. Leading anarcho-syndicalists such as Juan Piero spoke out against crimes and excesses carried out by his members, and many civil governors, teachers, and mayors, all of whom were loyal to the left, did what they could to prevent innocents from being killed. Similarly, repressions were carried out in nationalist-controlled zones against those confirmed or suspected to be sympathetic to the Republic and their allies. The Nationalists quickly set about to create a military state and began to carry out a white terror against their opponents. Unlike the red terror, which was largely spontaneous and decentralized, the white terror in nationalist zones was centralized and systematic. The right was motivated by the notion of limpieza, or cleansing society of undesirable elements. General Molla, on June 30th, instructed the Moroccan troops to, quote, "eliminate all left-wing peasants, communists, anarchists, union members, Freemasons, etc." Another nationalist figure, Franco's press attaché Captain Gonzalo de Aguilera, stated that they had to, quote, "exterminate a third of the masculine population and cleanse the country of the proletariat." Once nationalist forces had occupied a town, they would start off by systematically executing union leaders, Republican ministers, and loyal Republican officials. Ironically, the nationalists called army officers who remained loyal to the Republic traitors, and sailors who had followed the government orders as mutinous. Lacking the men to carry out executions, phalangists often resorted to using inmates at local prisons as executioners. Initially, killing started off as discretionary, but soon evolved into a systematic policy of extermination of anyone the nationalists deemed as enemies. In Seville, for example, the only military garrison the nationalists were able to secure during the coup, any opponents of the nationalists were executed, from Republican officials all the way down to workers at the olive oil factory. In 1936 alone, 8,000 people were murdered by the nationalists in the city. Republican women in particular faced more gruesome fates at the hands of their executioners. In many instances, before being executed, they would be raped by each of their executioners, usually Moroccan or Phalangist soldiers, before finally being shot. In some cases, the rape of women was encouraged by nationalist officers, such as General Queipo de Llano, the rebel officer who captured Seville during the initial coup, who broadcast over the radio at nighttime, urging his troops to rape Republican women. It is undoubtedly true that both sides committed atrocities. However, it must be made totally clear that the killings from the left exploded right at the beginning of the coup before dropping off significantly throughout the remainder of the war. Furthermore, leftist killings were spontaneous and largely decentralized, rarely being sanctioned or planned by some higher authority. On the other hand, reprisals and killings in nationalist zones were motivated by a desire to cleanse Spanish society of certain elements, and killings were ordered by rebel officers in such a way so that known Republican elements within a particular town or city were systematically wiped out. Even so, killings were discretionary during and after the initial coup, but took on a more planned and methodical approach from 1937 onwards. It must also be stated that the killings by nationalists persisted throughout the war and were greater in scale and number than those perpetuated by the left. As one unnamed Basque nationalist, Catholic, and Republican wrote, "Blood, a great deal of innocent blood was shed on both sides, but the most radical difference as far as the Republican zone was concerned, which does not justify but at least explains the excesses, lies in the very fact of the military insurrection. The army, almost the entire secret police, the administration of justice, whatever police forces there were, whose duty it was to maintain order, revolted, leaving the legal government defenseless. The latter was compelled to arm the people. The jails were open to release friendly political prisoners, and the common law criminals who came out with them acted on their own account. Furthermore, with the stirring up of the lower depths of society, the malefactors that existed in every city, in every nation, came to the surface, and found an easy field for their work. In normal times, the police would have kept them under control, but the very insurrection deprived the government of coercive forces and helped the criminals to secure arms. Is it surprising that during the first few days of the revolt, these uncontrolled elements did as they pleased? At the same time, the extreme left-wing organizations dispensed justice in a rude and elementary fashion, the justice of men who had suffered and had been molded in an atmosphere of hatred. All this does not justify the crimes committed in the Republican zone, but it readily explains them. What cannot be explained, and even less justified, are the crimes, much greater in number and in sadism, that were committed precisely by that army, by that police force, by those educated young gentlemen who lacked for nothing and who boasted of their Catholicism. Spain was a deeply divided nation even before the coup. Forces on the left, from anarchists to liberals, were pitted against conservative and fascist forces on the right in the years leading up to the coup. Violence and bloodshed was a common occurrence in Spain prior to 1936, with workers' revolts being brutally crushed by the state and military forces like the Army of Africa, civil guards, and assault guards. The violence and revolutionary fervour only increased leading up to July 1936, until it finally came to a tipping point when rebel soldiers led by General Franco, Godet, Sanjurjo, and Mola rose up against the Republic, seizing control of various towns and the garrison in Seville. Although the coup ostensibly failed, with the Republic retaining control of most of the land, all of Spain's gold, and most of the navy and roughly half its military, their failure to ruthlessly crush the rebellion in its fledgling stages ensured that the coup would evolve into a fully fledged civil war. Atrocities began both during and after the coup, perpetuated by both left and right-wing forces, although the planned and systematic repressions carried out by the right collected a larger pool of blood, and the littering of mass graves across the Spanish countryside was so numerous during the war that some are still being uncovered to this day. The Spanish Civil War would rage for almost 3 years, seeing hundreds of thousands of people killed and the Republic transition into a repressive fascist state ruled by Francisco Franco for the next 35 years. Thanks for watching.